Okay, once again, I, Dr. Vinay Sharma, welcome you all in my channel that is Chalk and Talk. Okay, we discuss a lot about the central nervous system, spinal cord, and at the different level of the brain stem. Now we are reaching and moving toward the cerebrum. As we were discussing, we will reach from the lower to upper part of the central nervous system. In this order, let's discuss one of the most important relay station. We discuss about the tract, sensory tract as well as the motor tract. So now I want to discuss a relay station, a very minute relay station whose dimension are almost 4 centimeter in length, 4 centimeter in length, 1.5 centimeter to 1.5 centimeter transversely as well as the vertically, and that is thalamus. That is thalamus. Thalamus is a relay station. Thalamus is a relay station for different track, and from this relay station there is a further movement of the sensation toward the different cortical areas. Okay, that is, we will discuss about the thalamus. We will discuss about the thalamus in 2 sessions. In first session, we are moving toward the location and the relation of the thalamus, as well as the division of the thalamus. And in the second one, we will discuss how the different tracts are relaying into this thalamus. Okay, and for that, first of all, the dimension, the 4 centimeter length, 1.5 centimeter transversely as well as the vertically. This is the almond shaped structure. And now I want for the discussion of the relation and location, which is one of the prime location. It is situated in the lateral wall of the third ventricle. This structure is situated in the lateral wall of third ventricle. And for discussing all these, I am drawing one of the diagram which is supposed to be a coronal section passing through the third ventricle. And first and foremost, I am drawing the corpus callosum. This part of the corpus callosum, and this is the coronal section. Okay. Then, with the help of this, there is septum pellucidum, which is dividing between the two lateral ventricle, which is underneath this. And lastly, there is the fornix. This part is known as fornix. This is the septum pellucidum, lower part, that is known as fornix. This part is fornix. Okay. This is the fornix, which is just separating between the two lateral ventricle. I will draw that lateral ventricle here. This is the fornix. Okay. I'm labeling this. This is the fornix. And to the corpus callosum, in short, CC, corpus callosum. Okay. Just below this, we can see a ventricle. Okay, here is another ventricle, and this is the another ventricle. Just below this, there is the ventricle, slit-like ventricle. This is the slit-like ventricle. And that ventricle is known as the third ventricle. This is known as the third ventricle. This is the third ventricle. Now this is the third ventricle. Again, I am repeating, I am drawing a coronal section to show you the different relation of the thalamus. Okay. Next to this, there is thalamus, which is an almond shaped structure situated into the lateral to the third ventricle. Lateral to the third ventricle. Thalamus, which is lateral to the third ventricle. This is the thalamus, which is located in lateral wall of the third ventricle. This is located in the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Okay, this is located in the third wall of the third ventricle. Okay, this is the thalamus. This is the location of the thalamus. Not only that, this thalamus, now here it is. Now in this thalamus we are drawing a choroid plexus, the choroid plexus, which is projecting into the lateral ventricle, as well as into the third ventricle. This is the choroid plexus, which is not only projecting into the third ventricle, it's also projecting into the lateral ventricle. Here are the capillary plexus. Here are the capillary plexus of this choroid plexus. Okay, this is the choroid plexus. Next to this, I am drawing labeling the boundary of the lateral ventricle. This is the part of the lateral ventricle or paraventricles of one side in a dotted line, which is underneath the corpus callosum, and here it is one groove, second one, and going below, and this is the lateral ventricle. This is the lateral ventricle. First and second ventricle or lateral ventricle. Again, here it is, just below the corpus callosum, the lateral ventricle is there. There is a lateral ventricles. By the side of the lateral ventricle, one large nucleus, caudate nucleus, and to support this, again I want to draw one another diagram. There is the caudate nucleus, C-shaped caudate nucleus, having the head, body, tail, and rounded pulvinar part. This is the caudate nucleus, having the head, body, tail, and the pulvinar part. Within this can be like this. This is covering this. Within this groove of this, the thalamus is situated. This is the thalamus, which is situated or located within the groove of this. Caudate nucleus. So we can write here, this is the caudate nucleus, and this embedded structure is thalamus, and we are looking this from the third ventricle. Okay, so here is the caudate nucleus, but not only the caudate nucleus, styria terminalis, a part of the styria is here, and plus one very important vein is stereothalamic vein. There is stereothalamic vein. Caudate nucleus, thalamus with the styria terminalis, and thalmostriated vein. In between the caudate nucleus and this thalamus, two structural line. This is thalmostriated vein, and this is the stria. Okay, this stria. If I want to draw this one, is stria and thalmostriated vein. You can see this is going into this section. This is the section. Okay. One more important thing: a limb of the internal capsule, which is running like this. There is a genu, and the posterior limb. The fibers of the corticospinal tract and other fibers passing through this one, and this part is known as internal capsule. Internal capsule. An internal capsule having an anterior limb like this, a genu, and a posterior limb. The posterior limb is separated by the lentiform nucleus. Thalamus is separated by the posterior limb, the lentiform nucleus. Okay, I can draw much, but I think that's enough to show the relation of this one. Not only that, below the thalamus there is subthalamic nucleus. Subthalamic nucleus. And much more, there is red nucleus. Yes, you heard this term in the midbrain, the red nucleus, and the tract of the red nucleus which was crossing. Okay, this is the red nucleus. A gap between this few pathway of the basal ganglia is passing, and this field is known as foral field H1. I am naming all these structures because this having a relation with the thalamus. So first and foremost thing, I want to define the different relation of the thalamus. Thalamus, which is an almond shaped structure, which is almost 4 centimeter in length, embedded lateral to the third ventricle. This is lateral to the third ventricle, or its medial wall is adjacent to this one. Not only that, an interthalamic connection passes through the third ventricle also. There is an anterior end and a posterior end. The anterior end is pointed. Here, I want to say that I draw the anterior end is pointed. And the posterior end is broad. Okay, not like this, because this is the coronal section. The anterior end is pointed and posterior end is broad, which is known as pulvinar. Okay, pulvinar part. Okay, this is supposed to be thalamus, and length of the thalamus is 4 centimeter, transverse diameter 1.5, as well as the vertical is 1.5, embedded in medial part of this, the lateral to this third ventricle. Okay, now coming toward this is having a anterior end which is pointed and which is directed more medially, and a posterior end which is broader. Underneath this, the midbrain part, superior colliculus part of midbrain is there, and few embedded structure, lateral geniculate body and medial geniculate body is there. Okay, we will discuss later on. Okay, with this one, 2 ends. Now coming to the surface, there is the medial surface. You can see this is the medial surface. This is the medial surface of thalamus. There is a lateral surface of the thalamus. There is a superior surface of the thalamus, and there is the inferior surface of the thalamus. So with the 2 ends and the 4 surface, this almond shaped structure, again I want to say that is a relay station of different senses. Okay. Now relations. What are the relations? If we are talking about the upper part which is concerning with the caudate nucleus. Okay, this is the caudate nucleus. Actually, this is the head of caudate nucleus, separated by the stria and the thalmostrated vein. The thalamus is there. Above the thalamus, these are the structure. We can see this one. This diagram is showing the same relations of the upper surface. When you are talking about the inferior surface, you can see there is the subthalamic nucleus, there is a red nucleus, and especially a zone where the fibers are coming and reaching to the thalamus, and this is known as field of 4LH1, because basal ganglion also having connection with the thalamus, and below this there is another term, another part which is known as substantia nigra of the midbrain. Substantia nigra of the midbrain. You have heard the term substantia nigra, pars compacta and pars reticularis with the dopamine structures. So these structures, the subthalamic nucleus, red nucleus and the substantia nigra and field of 4L are below the thalamus. Okay, now coming toward the lateral aspect of the thalamus. Lateral aspect of the thalamus, and you can see the internal capsule, especially this part, posterior limb. The posterior limb of the internal capsule is separating the lentiform nucleus, and not only that, later on we will discuss a plexus, that is external medullary lamina of the thalamus. This is not given a book actually. Lateral external medullary lamina of the thalamus is separating the internal capsule, posterior limb of internal capsule, from the thalamus, and this is adjacent. This is forming a plexus over the thalamus which is separating the internal capsule from the thalamus. Okay, laterally there is a relation that the posterior limb of internal capsule is separated from the lentiform nucleus, and in between them there is some kind external medullary lamina is there. Okay, every time when I say it's a superficial, there is a deep. If there is a brevis, then it is profundus or large. If there is external medullary lamina, there should be some internal medullary lamina also. But we will discuss during the division of the thalamus, and we are now discussing about the lateral relation. Lateral relation is clear. Now I am coming toward the medial relation, and the medial relation of this thalamus is coming with the context of the third ventricle. When I am looking at the third ventricle, just adjacent structure is the thalamus, and this thalamus is separated by the ependyma of the third ventricle. Now this is also covered by the choroid plexus separated from the third ventricle. Actually, anterior end, especially the superior surface anterior end, is medially encroached by the third ventricle and laterally by the lateral ventricle. Okay, lateral ventricle also. These are few relations. Okay, once again, the anterior end, which is reaching up to the one foramen, third ventricle connecting the foramen, the anterior end. The posterior end is which is broader and known as pulvinar, which is covering lateral geniculate body as well as the medial geniculate body, concerning with the auditory pathway as well as the visual pathway. Okay, the superior surface, which is covered by the caudate nucleus and separated by the thalamus-striated vein as well as the stria terminalis. Okay, that is stria, and that the superior surface, the inferior surface concerned with the subthalamic nucleus, red nucleus and substantia nigra, and this is separated by the field of 4LH1. Medially it is separated, in between them there is slit-like cavity, and the slit-like cavity is third ventricle, and laterally it is separated by the posterior limb of the internal capsule. The posterior limb of the internal capsule with the lentiform nucleus. Okay, I can draw much more, one more external lamina of this globus pallidus, and then the claustrum is there. But drawing another diagram is not actually good for this one. Let's emphasize on the thalamus. That is the relation of the thalamus. Now coming toward the real thalamus, I want to rub this diagram to draw a real thalamus here, and how the division of the thalamus works. Division of the thalamus works. Okay. Now I am drawing a same thalamus which we are discussing. The thalamus is there, more vertical on the medial side because it's forming the boundary of the lateral ventricle. A pointed, much pointed anterior end and broader posterior end of the thalamus. Okay. This is a gray matter mass. And if the white matter is there, it will look separately. And there is a white matter strip, Y-shaped strip, which is separating this mass, dividing this mass Y-shaped division which is dividing this mass into anterior part. This is the anterior part or anterior group. Anterior part. This is the lateral part. And the medial part. Okay? And this medial part, adjacent to the medial part, there is some nuclei that is known as midline nuclei. This is known as midline nuclei. This white strip which is dividing, the thalamus into anterior, into lateral, into the medial part, anterior, lateral, medial part. This is the white strip, is itself having some kind of gray matter mass here, and this is known as interlaminary nucleus or nuclei. Interlaminary nuclei. I asked that this is known as, this whole strip is known as internal medullary lamina. Internal medullary lamina. This Y-shaped strip of the white matter mass is known as internal medullary lamina. Embedded nucleus is known as interlaminary nucleus, which is further divided into the centromedian, and most posterior medially present the fascicular nuclei. Okay, fascicular nuclei. Okay, so this is the internal medullary lamina, which is dividing the thalamus into three major parts. And I described some nuclei, that the midline nuclei, the interlaminary nuclei, which is fascicular, as well as the centromedian nuclei. Here I want to remind you again that if there is an internal medullary lamina, there is an external medullary lamina between the thalamus as well as the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So I was talking, if there is external, there is internal. Okay. Now the anterior group is further divided into AV, AM, anterior ventral, anterior dorsal, and anterior medial group. 3. AM, anterior ventral, anterior dorsal, and anterior medial group of nuclei, and these having some correction. Nuclei is a collection of the cell bodies of the neuron within the central nervous system. So this is the whole gray mass. Okay. Now further division of the lateral group. This is the pulvinar nucleus. This is the pulvinar part, and within the pulvinar part there is a laterally the lateral geniculate bodies lying there. And more medially there is a medial geniculate body. Is lying. Okay. Now this part, which is supposed to be the lateral part, is further divided. And near to the internal medullary lamina, this is the lateral dorsal group of nuclei, and this is the lateral posterior group of nuclei. This is the lateral dorsal group of nuclei, and this is the lateral posterior group of nuclei, because these are lateral to the internal medullary lamina. One of the most important group I am discussing here, that is this part. This is ventral group, and the first and foremost, the ventral group is divided into ventro-anterior. It's not anterior-ventral, it's a ventro-anterior. Next part of this one is known as ventrolateral. This is the ventrolateral part. And for the last part, which is remaining here is divided into two. This is the posterior, okay, this is the anterior, this is the lateral, and this should be the posterior, the ventroposterior. This complete ventroposterior divided into two parts. This part is known as ventroposterolateral, and that part is known as ventroposteromedial, VPL and VPM. This is the division, and this nuclei is medial group of nuclei. Okay, in this way the internal medullary lamina and other structures are dividing to the thalamus. First and foremost, the internal medullary lamina divide the thalamus into anterior, the lateral group, medial group, and very near to the midline there is a midline nuclei is there. Okay, then the posterior end is separate, which underneath which there is the lateral geniculate body as well as the medial geniculate body. Okay, now the lateral group is further divided into the more near, which is more near to the intermedullary lamina, into the lateral dorsal nucleus, and lateral posterior nucleus. Further, the ventral nucleus, ventral group of nucleus divided into ventro-anterior, the ventrolateral and ventro-posterior, especially concerning with the general senses of body. Ventro-posterior group is divided into ventro-posterior lateral as well as ventro-posterior medial group. This is the division of the thalamus, and these all nuclei are concerning with the very specific sensation. They working as a relay station. This is supposed to be a station for a bus or train, where the different stations and for the different region buses are there. Okay, some general body sensation will come from the body to the VPL, another is going to the VPL, and ventro-anterior nucleus is placing a different part. So we will discuss how the different route and connection to the different area of the thalamus into next lecture. But in concise way, I want to say that thalamus is just an almond-shaped grey structure which is embedded in the core part of the brain, which is working as a relay station for the different senses, which is having a heavily related with the other vital structures, as this is superiorly related with the caudate nucleus, thalmostrated vein, stria and stria. Below is related with the subthalamic nucleus, red nucleus, substantia nigra, and field of Forel, which is in between them. Field of Forel between them. Laterally, it is concerning with the internal capsule. In between them, there is the external medullary lamina, and this internal, especially the posterior limb of the internal capsule. If this is the internal capsule, if I am forming the V-shaped internal capsule, this is the anterior limb, this is the genu, and this is the posterior limb. Here, the caudate nucleus is here, and this is separated from the lentiform nucleus. The anterior, neither the anterior limb nor the genu is separated with this one. Okay, that was the lateral part. Medial is concerning with the third ventricle, slit-like cavity, or you can, every time you can say, in between the two thalamus there is the third ventricle. Okay, and superiorly is concerning with the choroid plexus also. Heavily related with the structures. This is further divided by the white strip or internal medullary lamina into Y-shaped order, dividing the anterior group, the lateral group, the medial group. Midline structures, centromedial nucleus is there, which is also very, very important for the reticular nucleus functions. Okay, and not only that, the broader posterior end is overlapping inferior laterally the lateral geniculate body and medial geniculate body, which are concerning with the visual as well as the auditory pathway. We discussed that in the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus level of the midbrain. Okay, one by one we will discuss these group of the thalamus, how they are concerning with the other connections in next session and with the clinical applied. Hoping so that you should listen and view this video for the further exploration of the thalamus and what is the activity of the thalamus. Thanking you.